Hey, Welt here. Some incredible news dropped during yesterday's livestream. In patch 2.7, we will be receiving a 5-star standard unit selector. Some people are still missing key standard units even now, and maybe an Eidolon is just what you need. Around this time last year, I ranked the 5-star standard units, so what poetic timing to be able to redo it with all the new changes since then. Tons of new supports, relics, light cones, synergies, and archetypes have arrived, so it's gonna shake things up. I will be evaluating why you'd want to choose each unit, as well as this time properly evaluating their Eidolons, something I didn't really do last year. So like and sub if this helps, let me know your choice for this selector, and let's begin. Bailu is first. Last year I rated her decently since we didn't have that many sustain units, and having a 5-star sustain is a nice boon for starting players. Bailu provides a bunch of healing and invigoration, which remains to this day the only source of damage reduction among abundance units. She is technically the best healer at preventing one-shots. She also has some emergency healing thanks to this invigoration, but then she falls off there. Emergency healing is not as substantial or consistent as a Lingsha or Luocha or Huohuo, and she cannot cleanse, which is really rough as always, even if in some fights it's kinda negligible. Finally, even if she did have a cleanse, she offers no other utility. A revive is cool, but Lingsha's damage amp and personal damage, or Huohuo's energy gifting mechanics, kinda just destroy that. If you're an older player, she's a skip, and only new players should be considering her. And even then, they have higher priorities up next. With Gallagher existing, you already have a better 4-star option anyways, and Lynx is okay too with a niche in aggro-based comps. Let's now talk about Bailu Eidolons. Her E1 would be useful if it was consistent, as it is one of the only sources of energy gifting in the game, but it is not consistent. And then every other Eidolon is kinda whatever. Her E4 sounds okay for damage utility, but it's RNG, it's weak, and it requires using skill a ton to maximize it. Ideally, we aren't using skill too much on her, just like any top tier sustain wouldn't, and using skill for just 30% damage isn't a good idea anyway. Sorry, Bailu. Bronya, however, brings the best out of the bees, as even all the way in 2.6, she still finds use. Bronya is still the only unit, until Sunday comes out, that can advance a unit like she can. For example, Sparkle does only a 50% advance even if she has other uses. And sure, Robin can immediately advance the whole team, but that's once per ult, and she is restricted to only those ults which are gated by action value. Bronya can let a unit take a turn immediately, and she can do this every turn of hers if she has enough skill points. But that's the problem, skill points. Bronya consumes 1 SP a turn at E0 S0 and also doubles DPS actions. Most DPS consume a skill point a turn, which makes things even worse. Because while Sparkle only usually generates 0.33 SP a turn, she isn't doubling DPS actions, so it doesn't feel as bad. But yeah, Bronya is still top tier for Butel, Blade, and Jingliu. Butil wants extra turns more than anyone, and Blade and Jingliu have lower SP consumption to allow her to run -1 speed no problem. She also has the Mosquito team with Robin Gallagher and a high frequency attacker, most of the time March 7th Hunt. It's a very fun team using multiple synergies to their peak potential. And finally, she can be a weaker replacement for Robin in Fei Xiao teams. Will Bronya get replaced by Sunday? Probably, but she will still have her advance forward for maybe Sunday Bronya combos, and Sunday can't advance Harmony units, which may grant her a very small niche. I think Bronya is still a top tier pick for newer units to get your Harmony roster started, and only falls off if you have a bunch of limited Harmonies. Onto Eidolons, as picking up more than one Bronya is still fantastic. First, her E1. It may be RNG, but a skill now and then returning an SP helps a lot with her playstyle's heavy SP consumption. Then her E2 enables some cool setups. You can run around base speed DPS and they will get a speed buff big enough to go ahead of Bronya. From there, you have a -1 speed Bronya setup with a DPS that barely built speed. It could also just be used to do her usual setup at even higher speed thresholds. E4 is rarely used, but funny when it works, and E6 is another banger like E1 and E2. E6 increases her skills buff turn duration by 1, which increases her power with out of turn action units. A unit like Jin Yuan, for example, cannot have his Lightning Lord buffed by Bronya's 66% damage until E6. So if you don't need any other unit, you can't go wrong with more Bronyas. Clara next, and she still performs really well for a standard DPS released in 1.0. She's all about her counters, which are considered as follow-up attacks, so any future aggro or follow-up, supports or buffs in endgame can fit her very nicely. She is just a nice unit into all game modes, but falls off the most in Apocalyptic Shadow. They did legit release Clara Pro Max in 2.5 with Yun Li, so if you got her, you can just ignore Clara unless you're going for a meme team, and Clara won't be beating recent DPS like Rapper, Boot Hill, Facial, Acheron, and even Firefly is coming back next patch. If you're an older player, you can pretty much ignore picking up a Clara meta-wise. For newer players, she's a beefy DPS that can help clear a bunch of random content and fits somewhat into all endgame modes. She's also fantastic into Simulated Universe, which may be a nice reason to select her to help advance in those game modes early on. Now for those older players, Clara's Eidolons are actually kinda cool. If she's your only 5-star physical carry, maybe you can give her a chance. E1 lets her spam skill and do tons of consistent damage. It's a pretty decent pickup for Clara enjoyers. E2 is an okay, but permanent attack buff realistically. E4 is whatever, just damage reduction, but finally E6 makes her have a chance to counter when allies are attacked and also increases the enhanced counter amount by 1. This is a pretty powerful one, though you can get your ultimate up quite easily, which heavily boosts your aggro, which heavily diminishes the chance of allies being hit in the first place. So the ally counters are nice in niche scenarios, but the second part is still big. Now, Gepard has similar strengths and weaknesses to Bailu. He brings a hefty shield to the squad on his ultimate, and otherwise doesn't really do much. His skill can freeze and come in clutch, and he can revive himself once. However, unless E1 the freeze is low chance, and even at E1 a lot of enemies these days have freeze or CC res. His shield being tied to his ultimate means energy reducing enemies or just bad RNG means a lack of shield for the team. No refreshing like Aventurine or perma uptime like Fushuan. He has to get that ultimate back up in time. And since again, it's tied to his ultimates, fast allies or an action advanced team destroys his shield uptime. Just like Bailu, he will sustain teams somewhat, but his utility is lacking otherwise, and he has no source of debuff removal unless he legit dies. Though he still has some niche, as he has innate aggro in his kit, and he is a preservation. Head with the Trent Light Cone and you have a decent starting sustain for Acheron. If you need a sustain badly and you've just started, you can consider him like Bailu, but otherwise I'd ignore him. E1 fixes his skill's low base chance, so he has some extra sustaining utility versus non-CC res or freeze res enemies. Nice Eidolon if you really love him. E2 otherwise forces you to hit that freeze even harder. E4 is actually kinda cool, but it's just a venturing passive, but much weaker. And E6 is just depressing. Now for Himeko, the comeback queen. Just like with Herta, her relevancy skyrocketed with Pure Fiction's release. But unlike Herta, Himeko got another boost. Super Break being released has seen Himeko's popularity and usage rise again. All thanks to them shilling Firefly, who is fire and a break DPS. This means content, supports, and even super niche planers can all be abused by Himeko as well. She is much cheaper than getting a Firefly. Himeko also has a break-oriented talent, which means these now very frequent ally breaks are going to be supercharging that bad boy. And more follow-ups from Himeko is more damage, more break damage. She is the best DPS among standard units and a top-tier unit for Pure Fiction. She does really well into Apocalyptic Shadow too, since it's a break-based game mode. And in MOC she can pop off too. She can go crit or hybrid with break, and has a variety of different teams where she can excel. Truly a jack of many trades. She will even be getting a buff in 2.7 with Fugue coming out, a super break enabler that also brings Exo Toughness, which is a mechanic that makes Himeko's talent go off even more. Alongside Bronya, Himeko is a must pick up if you don't have her. If you don't have Bronya and Himeko, well, it's a choice between a great harmony and a great DPS. And if you have both and are satisfied with Bronya, onto Himeko Eidolons. E1 is pretty much a permanent 20% speed buff, which is extremely underrated and powerful. She can drop speed and still hit high speed thresholds, giving her more stats to work with. or she can just go crazy fast, whatever you prefer. After that though, it gets a bit mid. E2 is a conditional damage buff, it has bad uptime, and it's legit only 15% damage. E4 makes her gain an extra point of charge on her skill if she breaks. Now this is rarely relevant, since Himeko can't overcap on charge stacks. Maybe a future support would let her. But anyways, the only time E4 would benefit her is if you specifically break a non-elite or boss with your skill and only your skill. And also you'd have to make sure you aren't breaking other enemies that would just waste this extra charge point. Finally, E6 is just extra damage. It's a multiply increase and buffs her single target capabilities, I guess. I just stick to grabbing E1 and then maybe just focusing on Bronya. Well, Welt. Welt is still one of my favorite units. I love his delaying playstyle. He focuses on damage and delaying enemies with some damage amping on top. But his damage is pretty subpar, requires a lot of investment, and Himeko or Clara would be better choices for damage. For utility, he can completely obliterate an enemy's action value, meaning they will rarely take a turn. But that is only if the enemy doesn't have Imprison or CC Red. Enemies with either one of these in a high percentage pretty much nullify Welt's kit outside of damage. And the problem with his kit being centered on delay is delaying an enemy is fantastic for survivability, but boosting your DPS actions with speed or advance forward is gonna actually kill the enemy faster. We play in cycle-based endgame modes, not who can stall the longest modes. He still sees some use. Some people still rock him as a main DPS, some as a super break carry. Some people run him as a sub DPS, and he's okay with Acheron. He doesn't bring the damage amp of a Silver Wolf or Jiao Cho, but he does bring survivability for newer Acheron players. But anyways, new players I don't think should pick him up, since he won't serve much purpose, and if you did want him for damage, well, the gear requirements are too much in the early game. Older players can pick him up for his niche uses, meme teams, or cause they love him a lot. Now, the thing is, his Eidolons are all really good together. E1 is a small damage boost by itself, but it shines with future Eidolons. E2 is a big boost to ultimate frequency and thus more damage. It also means more E1 procs. E4 improves slow consistency, which helps both survivability and his talent, which relies on slow procs. So more consistent damage. And E6 means one more bounce on his skill, which means more energy from his E2, more slows, more damage, and more talent procs. His Eidolons are honestly awesome, but only a priority if you really want to invest into him. It won't suddenly make him a tier 0 DPS, but it will make him much more fun and decently strong. Yanqing is last, but also least. His lore is cool and I love him in events, but we all know the memes about his kit. His self buffs are awesome, but rely on specifically running a shielder to keep them up. So Gepard, who is quite weak, or Aventurine. His self buffs are also mostly packed onto his ultimate's damage, which means outside of that, he has a hard time doing damage and doesn't crit all that much. Because you don't want to overcap too much on crit rate, but you still kind of want to crit on skills and their follow-ups. And if you maybe want to solve that, you have to rely on his RNG signature. And then his talent is inconsistent. It only has a 60% fixed chance to do a follow-up attack. In 2024, we don't do non-guaranteed follow-ups. And he also has a low base chance for freezing, which would have helped his survivability and buff uptime. And the thing is, even if you give him a Spark or Robin Aventurine comp, he still isn't popping off as much as Clara or Himeko could. You will see the occasional crazy zero cycle with crazy investment and supports with Eidolons. If you really like him, could do that too. He's probably the weakest choice among 5 stars, since even if you are new, you'd need a shielder for him to be consistent enough, and any other DPS would be easy to run except for Welt with his gear requirements. But finally, his Eidolons. E1 could be nice additional damage, except it's not too often that you're getting freezes off. E2's energy is too little to matter for rotations, at least when I looked at him for his guide over a year ago. It's cool to have, but you shouldn't rely on it. E4 is actually quite good, but relies on literally taking no damage. Since that's the goal of his team, pull E4. And E6 sounds nifty, now his turn after his ult gets a buff, but he's a nuke-based DPS and pushing damage onto non-bosses isn't really what he does, which means he won't be proccing this all too often. So to summarize, Bronya or Himeko are my top picks for both new and older players. For new players, Bailu and Gepard have some extra value as your very first 5-star sustain. though you could also pull on a banner with Gallagher and grab a few copies of him. Clara is a great all-around DPS if you need one of those, and Yanqing and Welt are not necessary for anyone except fans. The Eidolons I'd focus on are Bronya and E1 Himeko. If you use Clara, then you can go for hers instead of Himeko if you prefer. And Welt Enjoys can go all in for his E6 if they want to see him shine a lot more. So I hope this helped. There's been quite a shift in power for Himeko, and otherwise a bunch of units dropped off. Bronya got some new synergies, and who knows what we have in store for us with Amphorius. I'm excited to maybe see how this looks in a year, but I doubt it need another video. We'll see. Anyways, thanks to my amazing YouTube members, thank you all for watching, and have a good day.